as we enter 2025, a new year on some calendar, it's a good time to reassess, take a moment. Usually we have a little bit of break in some of our daily actions at this time, hopefully at least for a day or two, to find ways to recommit to ourselves, to search for growth, to just have something new take place in our life that maybe edges out a few of the things we would like not to be there. This video here was recorded on New Year's Eve and is an opening up into that new season, a way of dealing with a little bit of the complexity and conflict, the overlapping and seemingly trapped and interlocked feelings and agendas we might have, and letting them disperse, letting them become something new, letting them grow into their own complex and beautiful field. It'll be a pretty simple drawing to start with, just a few interlocking shapes, blocks hugging onto each other, fitting here and there on their outer and inner edges, providing space for others to sit within, but just the 2D shapes that we'll then explore, extruding, drawing up into volume, and in that space of interlocking volumes, we generate intensities of overlap. We find new pathways, new figures, new connections, and develop a series of visual, formal relationships on the page that can perhaps begin to tell a story. Let us open our imagination through these few moments of mindfulness and practice of intention. I'll primarily use pencils today. I have a few at hand, a couple of HB just to make sure they stay nice and crisp, a 2H in case we need a little lightness, and a big heavy pencil to bring a little softness and shade into things. Anything will work though. You can do it all with one pen. It'll probably be a little bit intense on the pen in terms of doing some shading if you're comfortable with that, or just a simple notebook pencil will work just fine. For the filming and interaction, I use a piece of Bristol taped to a desk because it keeps everything stable and clean for the camera. Make sure I don't lean in too far or move out of frame. But for you at home, anything that works for you to draw on is perfectly fine. Bristol paper takes the mediums nice. A sketchbook made for that will be okay to engage with, move around, hold in your lap, be comfortable with. Or any pad of printer paper, notebook paper will provide a surface for lines and edges to form on. So go ahead and gather your supplies, establish your space, and let's draw together. And this exercise, and do a little meditation on overlapping, interlocking shapes, like little toy blocks that might fit together or something, and see how dense and complicated it gets. A lot of the exercise will be in being okay with not being able to see everything and dealing with complexity that builds up from drawing piece by piece versus knowing where everything's going to go. So the simple part in the warm-up will be getting an idea of how some shapes could interlock. I'll probably draw at an angle like this, and roughly, 45 or 30, 60 or something, because it makes the steps come together a little easier, but it really doesn't matter. But thinking of that interlocking two pieces where they'll share some of their form, some of their edges, and fit together in some way. So we have a little Tetris-y sense to it as they wrap around, but things can get a little bit more free and playful. Something could have really funky edges, anything like that. Probably take a little more time in the exercise to draw them and keep their sides clean and a bit parallel, but anything really goes as you play around throughout the drawing. They could have more complex key-like shapes inside of them that other pieces come in and fill. And even though I'm making all of these more rectangular kind of in their shape, because it keeps things kind of simple in the drawing, there's no reason they couldn't have a little bit more organic form or bubbly form. It's all kind of the same, following edges, finding that interlocking space between them, and then giving them their own outer profile as it continues to grow and fit, like puzzle pieces would work. The easier it is for your hand to move and draw, so playing a little bit during this warm-up exercise of what feels comfortable or just interesting visually. I think I'll stick with the blockier ones. Some can even be boring little blocks. And what we'll do after those give us a little bit of game play on the page is begin to bring them out into 3D a little bit. And this is where everything's going to get messy and overlapped. But any corner can take and draw up in a direction or out in a direction, some distance. And an adjacent corner can do the same thing. As long as they're about the same height, same distance, everything stays kind of relative or parallel, they'll look like a block. If things are different distances, they'll just start to look like a block that has a slope to it. So anything can work. Doesn't have to be perfectly accurate, and that's something for you to explore, practice, or just play around with in the overall drawing. But if we go all the way around, we get a little 3D volume shape there, but everything starts to layer on top and overlap, and that's where some pencil or some shading can come into play. If we begin to, for instance, give a little darker fill to one side, say always on the left here, and then a little bit lighter fill to another side, like the right face. It starts to cover up a little bit of what's in the background and give it a little more presence on the page. Similarly, we could add some intensity or fill to the top surface and begin to cover what's behind. We'll let that come in a little later in the exercise after things get maybe a little overwhelmingly interlocked and overlapped, and see what comes out of it. I think pencil might just be a little easier to do the shading, and it's a little worn on those, but otherwise everything will work just fine. As we move to the bigger exercise, taking a moment just to sit there with the page, you take it in with the eyes, take in the surroundings, whether that's the edge of a sketchbook, the desktop or tabletop behind it, the way the paper's held down and its orientation to you. Just noticing a bit of it for some time, becoming present with that territory of interaction, engagement, feeling out the pen or pencil a little, its weight, its shape, the way it sits in the hand, and the way you feel like holding it anyway can work well. But after a few breaths with that, making that connection, the space between us, our eyes, our hand, and the paper, the table. Beginning with that first shape to mark out some territory and give the initial direction and orientation to the page. Finding an edge and making that first mark. And having a bit of an angle, like that's roughly 45 or something, can just make it a little simpler to see, but anything can work. The shapes can be weird shaped, curvy shaped, rectangular shaped. Anything will work just fine. Start moving around the perimeter. Maybe you have a plan in mind. Maybe just knowing that we need some bumps and some inlets. So moving back and forth, trying to work all the way around. If anything gets messed up, like the edge, the parallel, you could always clean it up a little bit. This first one, establishing, getting comfortable and familiar with that space of the paper, and bringing something from the warm-up into it. And then we'll begin growing outwards with the shape, choosing a place of interaction, a dent, a corner, an outer shape to anything will work. And beginning again to draw and move around. And just have a little fun playing, not necessarily needing to know exactly where the shape will begin or end. Not really worrying about things lining up or not. You can choose whether the shared edges directly overlap each other, or like I've left a little bit of a gap. Anything will work there. Or just making these shapes full of potentials for nesting, connecting with their edges, fitting, and really building out an interconnected map of space around things. We'll work out for a while, but as we do and get more comfortable with the game, each piece playfully defined, we can begin to enter that act of making the forms a little bit more mindfully, building up a little bit of connection there with the page by using attention to the breath and attention to the marking, bringing them a bit into alignment with a little relaxation and a little focus at the same time. So whenever you reach your next intervention, the next shape to interlock there, taking a moment to really set the body, set the mind to that drawing, using a couple of inhalations and exhalations to ground, to feel your stability. And when you're ready, on one end of the breath or the other, an inhalation or exhalation, bringing the pencil in contact with the paper and begin to draw on the action of the breath. It was just one edge at a time for a little while. Slowing it down, breathing in, moving on the other side of that cycle or rhythm. For me, the in to find location and the out to make an interaction comes naturally. Breathing in to be in a place for a little bit, and then breathing out to make a mark. The breath may give guidance to the length of one of those marks, or may just follow what the hand feels, what the eye sees, a little leftover here and there, either in motion or in the cycle of breathing. But those starting points of engagement or something within our guidance. Breathing in to find the place, breathing out to make the mark, and letting the rest catch up in between. That are really slowing it down for a little while, the shape taking its time to form, bringing greater connection to each edge that wraps around some space. Slowly define the figure. You got a lot of paper, plenty of room to work, and plenty of time to work with, so no rush to fill everything. using the more deliberate breaths for a few shapes, just to really let that oxygen sink in. Let the mind slow down. Let the senses open up. Going a little slower, you might feel a little more connection to the pen or pencil, the way it sits in the hand. What we do with it between actions. How we place it on the page. Breaths don't have to be deep. Just starting and a placing of action. Finding a speed that keeps you engaged and lets you engage. Mindfully with that act, I'll do a couple more shapes like this. If you want, you can begin interacting on the inhalation and the exhalation. A little more control required, so it doesn't have to get away from you. Into a line, out to a line. Moving around the shapes given. Interlocking their edges. Finding new little figures in and out with each cycle, replenishing the inhalation and the exhalation. Always a little pause as we catch up to ourselves. Some time to readjust, to reflect and prepare. There should be plenty of open edges, new places for interaction as we approach the transition in the exercise. Think about completing your final shape or two, the final notches in the open-ended puzzle. And then you complete those last couple shapes, taking just a moment to recollect. Feel free in the exercise of having fun here in this part of it, just to continue growing and adding and interlocking shapes. Gonna move to giving the shapes a little bit of dimension in another direction, a little bit of volume from the 2D area, and see if we can sort our way through with our eye and our hand that overlapping of the interlocking forms. And you can always just continue to draw shapes connected, whatever, jump back and forth happens. Here, it might make some sense to start back to front, left to right, but You can take a moment and let the eye scan around, find the figure that draws you in. Just begin wherever it feels like a nice spot to see a little volume, and draw a line upward from one point. Again, any direction can work. Try to be consistent, will look more naturally 3D. Just another axis into space. It just changes our perception of the volume. And the line's going up the same distance, giving some attention visually and spatially to direction, the orientation. It's very easy to have little overlaps and misalignments. They'll slowly fade into the drawing as you're noticing and feeling out the space. The eye doing its best to maintain parallel relationships. The more lines that start to come into play, the more we can use them as reference. But don't feel there's any problem with overdrawing or overlapping to find an intersection where two lines cross is the best way to make a point. And work your way around that shape, move to new shapes as you see fit. Slowly add greater and greater rectangles if you happen to be doing something perhaps curvy, non-rectilinear, non-orthogonal. You can just pull up points wherever there's kind of a change, significant change in curvature, or a corner, significant redirection. And then over time, as you pull up the lines about the same distance, begin to draw again, shape from below up above. You'll start to fill in the volume of the form. It just may take a few more rounds if you're doing with something more complex. You may start to notice that even with connecting all the edges, the eye shifts back and forth between what is top, what is bottom, what is front, what is back. And if that brings a challenge to seeing, one thing is to come back over it, and just bring a little intensity to one edge or the other. I go around the now formed perimeter of this shape and make it stand out a little bit stronger from the background. And reinforce some of the verticals towards the front and let the ones in the back be lighter. Things may start to look more voluminous. I'm going to do a few more in this lighter wireframe and then begin to look at shading some of the edges so things will get messier before they get cleaner. But at any time, as we did in the warm-up, gets too hard to see, you can always begin to shade in sides, just bringing a little difference to left, right, and top to let the volume show a little bit more. And what I think I'll do to play around with that is, as I work on a new shape, change the height higher or lower that it goes up each time, so there's a little difference. Start to play the game of the volumes, having that potential void interlocking in the 3D as well as the 2D. And you might start to see the system, understand how it works, so start moving at a pace that feels comfortable to you, whether that's quick or just slow, taking the time to align edges and move in equal distances. See into the background these hidden alleyways, streets between volumes. At any point, things get overwhelmingly dense or complex, taking a few breaths, closing the eyes for a moment to let them reset, and coming back in, retracing, finding the figure above and below, and using the eyes, sort, organize, give the next interaction of the hand. It's very possible to miss a connection here or there. It may come back later, found as losing coherence of the volume, or it may disappear into the background of everything we draw. So don't need to worry too much. Drawing is made of layers, multiple back and forth, going over, reading and rereading. And this is just the first pass of many. As we take a few minutes of more quiet drawing, whether it's sorting through the wireframes or beginning to add a little shading into the drawing, just spend some time between you and what is emerging on the page, practicing that seeing, the system of extending axes, changing shape to volume, and reinforcing the depth of interlocking and overlapping that begins to take place. As we start to approach the end of the half an hour, you might see interesting opportunities emerge. The way you choose to apply, say, tone or texture can reinforce or begin to obfuscate what's seen down below. You may see opportunities for not seeing, letting the three-dimensional aspects blend back into the two-dimensional aspects, volume and shape oscillating between our perception. We begin to see opportunities for a story on the page. These interlocking block forms reminding us of toys or cities or other things. Recognizing some of what emerges in the drawing that may at first not have had specific intention, but over time grows to its own relationships and connections that build a story with our imagination. And if you have time, you can continue drawing into it, exploring, figuring out what it offers. Or if it's time to move on to the next thing, finding a place to choose to put down a pen or pencil, a finishing for whatever that means for your time here. Maybe that's finishing, filling out the last portion of something started, seeing to completion the final shape's perimeter or boundary, and placing down the pen or pencil, bringing the hands to rest for a moment. You can always enter back in again. But for now, taking that pause, work started, practice has been engaged. It may either take that out farther into the drawing as creative energy or take a few breaths and recuperate and let the relaxation and openness of the mind trickle out into the rest of our day. Maybe some of my mind is trained in an architecture and working in that field, right? These extrusions, these blocks, they take on a certain story about buildings and cities and strange streets and alleyways in between. And we all may have seen a little bit of that in our lives, whether it's through video games, maps, storybooks, drawings at a museum, and probably can come to mind. But you might find other things there, and I'm more interested. I find myself more interested now in that jittery space of overlap, the flux, the choices of how to refine a face or an edge next to each other that all blend and disperse and mingle together, taking the discrete ideas of interlocking shapes and forms, of overlapping tone and hatch pattern, bringing them together into something new, an interlocking overlapping, an emergence of a conceptual space that we can now read into. And for my own practice of design and interest in drawing, this might be an opportunity to take something like a tracing paper or a vellum, a transparent medium, overlap one more time with that occlusion layer, and then begin to see what forms. Because we have a structure of the X, Y, and Z axis, the diagonal and the vertical, the various forms aligning and misaligning give us a place to begin, but that messier space in between, or maybe relaxed space in between, softer, more open, more ready for interpretation and creativity. I hope you enjoyed the exercise and can find some mediation through the breath with those places of discomfort as things become crowded and difficult to follow and hard to see. We relax into them and trust the system and see what emerges. It's nice to be back here, and I hope everyone's new year is off to a great start. Hope you can join each week, usually on Wednesdays, for new episodes of Mindful Drawing here on YouTube. Feel free to subscribe to get notifications about them, and give me a thumbs up below. Let me know what you found in the comments through your own mindful practice. And whenever you do, draw well. Thank you. Let's see what we can sort out of this. Just a little bit more playing and drawing, having some fun.